Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Niagara Virtual Lecture Series. I am Michaela Darlene, and I will serve as your moderator for tonight's lecture. We give thanks to the Niagara Foundation and the Turkish American Society for sponsoring tonight's event. These organizations are doing amazing work, connecting people and building bridges across cultures and faiths. Their work is especially appreciated during this time when there is so much anxiety and fear. I thank you for being a voice of hope. Tonight's presentation will be from Father Thomas Michel. It is my pleasure to introduce you to him. Father Thomas Michel has a doctorate in Islamic theology from the University of Chicago, specializing in the thought of Ibn Taymiyya. After teaching Islamic studies at Columbia University in New York, he taught for 9 years at Sanata Dharma University in Indonesia. Between 1981 and 1994, Father Michel worked in the Vatican under Pope Paul John II as head of Office for Relations with Muslims. In 1986, he began to teach courses in history of religions in universities in Turkey. In 2000, he delivered the Darcy Lectures at Oxford University on themes of Muslim-Christian relations. In 2008, he received the International Peace Prize from the Central Islamic Institute of Germany. And in 2009, he received the Ali Shir Navai Award from the International Turkish Olympiad in Ankara, Turkey. In 2010, he was awarded the degree of Doctor of Theology by the Catholic Theological Union of Chicago, Illinois. In 2013, he received the Building Bridges of Understanding Award from Alwaleed Center of Muslim-Christian Understanding of Georgetown University. Until 2016, he taught religious studies at the School of Foreign Service of Georgetown University in Doha, Qatar. He now teaches at Xavier Learning Center in Chiang Rai, Thailand. Father Thomas Michel, it is a great honor to have you with us tonight. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Niagara Foundation for organizing and sponsoring this event. And I want to greet you, my Muslim friends who are engaged in fasting and obedience to God's command. And I send my greetings also to all persons of goodwill who have chosen to listen to this program. During the time allotted to me, I would like to share with you some advice that I find helpful in the context of this great crisis facing humanity, that of the coronavirus, or COVID-19. What is unique about this crisis is that it affects humanity as a whole. It is not a problem of one nation or another, of a certain region of the globe, or of one religious community or another, but is something that affects us all. Affects us simply because of our common humanity. In this way, the present crisis is different from the wars and earthquakes and floods that we may have previously experienced. And it's even different from the endemic scourge of poverty. The coronavirus crisis has shaped our outlook in many ways and has brought about gloom, uncertainty, and anxiety. Instability has replaced solidity in the lives of many because of this new and unforeseen disease. People's plans for the future are on hold. Students' futures are in jeopardy. People are caring for loved ones or mourning those who have died. Nations' economies are in shambles. Unemployment is high, and the political system in every country around the world is challenged to the limit. In this dark and uncertain situation, many of us have turned to our faith in God to find direction, strength, hope, and stability. We find there our motivation for turning outwards in service of others, particularly those most marginalized and in need. In the faith tradition of Abraham, to which millions of Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others belong, we learn to respond to this trial as people of faith who try to respond to the challenges in the way that God teaches us, with the wisdom and the strength that God gives us. As we seek to live more deeply before our Creator with the obedience of faith, we discover how much we children of Abraham have in common and how we can learn from each other's spiritual experience. A common element that we children of Abraham find in our faiths is what people today often call spirituality. We might describe spirituality as a need for something transcendent in our lives, for internalized ethical norms, for a discipline that gives structure and ardor to our behavior, for a way to discover the divine in the midst of the challenges of modern life. Spirituality is an opening to encounter eternal values and wisdom, which we believers find in the message of God. If spirituality is the way we internalize the teaching and the practice of religion, so that it shapes and informs and transforms our behavior, then we who have faith in God can gain much from sharing our spirituality with each other. As a Christian, I find hope in my belief that God has raised his servant Jesus from the dead, so that he continues to live with his community and his Spirit guides us on the right path. I find in the words and deeds of Jesus my motivation to serve those who suffer, the widows and orphans of our world, the marginalized, the homeless, refugees who flee poverty and oppression. I find strength in the example of Jesus undergoing suffering without reacting in anger and revenge. These are some of the ways that I have been formed by my faith tradition to live this coronavirus scourge in accord with God's will. But because of our shared spirituality, I can also learn much from Islamic teaching and from the insights of good, holy Muslims. As some of you may already know, I have spent many years of my life studying the writings of a Muslim scholar, Sayyid Nursi. His many faith-filled writings have been brought together in a huge collection called the Risale-i-Nur, that is the message of light. One part of this Risale-i-Nur collection I find to be most relevant to the health crisis that the world is facing today. One part that is most relevant is his advice for sick people. So I thought what I would do today is to look again at Nursi's advice for the sick and explore its relevance for a world that is undergoing a terrible pandemic. As a human family, we are facing in COVID-19 an illness that weakens and kills. The way that we approach this crisis tells much about our personal and communitarian spirituality. How we approach the COVID-19 shows the attitudes and convictions that are rooted in our faith. In his message for the sick, Nursi makes a startling statement. For you, he tells his readers, illness is good health, while for some of your peers, good health is sickness. Well, what on earth did he mean? And what can we learn from this? I think it's worth our while to take a new look at Nursi's insights on sickness and health, and to reflect on how this wisdom can guide us at this time. Nursi believes that the physical illnesses that we suffer can never be separated from what he calls spiritual sickness, or sickness of the heart. The sickness of the heart that Nursi sees as afflicting modern men and women is one caused by lack of faith. It is the feeling of being without direction or hope, the incapacity to love, and a view of the absurdity of life that afflicts those whose life is not informed by faith. Positivist materialism, belief in nothing beyond what we can see and touch and measure, is a common spiritual sickness of our time. This basic disorder arising from the lack of faith in God and a transcendent system of values precipitates multiple societal ills. Faith in God produces in us a positive, optimistic attitude of acceptance that enables us to avoid hopelessness and despair by taking proper health precautions, by finding the patience necessary to follow medical advice, and by avoiding premature, dangerous activity. Now, there's much more I could say about Nursi's approach to sicknesses of the spirit, but I would like to focus this afternoon mainly not on spiritual sickness, but rather on physical sickness. Now, the first thing to remember is that Sayyid Nursi does not idealize sickness in the manner of some 19th century romantic poets. He is quite realistic in holding that good health is a blessing from God for which the believer should hope and pray, whereas illness is never to be sought for its own sake, nor brought about by one's own effort. It is a pious act, he says, to ask that if it be God's will, one may enjoy good health. On the other hand, good health is not an absolute good. The believer can also ask that, God willing, the Lord grant ills and their remedies. Nursi notes that just as illnesses are one of the surest means to push someone to come before God in supplication and worship, so also release from illness is a privileged occasion for thanking and praising God. Prayer enables us to see the world as a huge hospital full of sick people who come before God, the compassionate healer who answers the needs of all. A deep spirituality leads us to understand that since both health and illness come from God, faith consists of accepting willingly and patiently whatever God sends, and placing one's trust in God, the healer of bodies and souls. Even though sickness is never to be sought, much less brought about by self-destructively misusing one's own body, when God in divine wisdom nevertheless allows illness to befall a person, a community, or a nation, there are some positive spiritual benefits to be reaped and lessons to be learned. First of all, sickness is a reminder of the reality of death, without which people could go on for years in heedless and foolish complacency. It is experiences like sickness, old age, and natural disasters that can be an occasion for egoistic, misguided people to wake up and realize the damaging existence that they have made for themselves. Secondly, sickness makes one appreciate the blessing of health. Those who enjoy unbroken health can easily take this great gift of God for granted and presume that it is the normal state for all humankind. Especially today in a country like the United States, with its advanced and effective medical research, expertise, and facilities, one can complacently feel that sickness is on the run. Health is our hard-earned and well-deserved fate, and it is a matter of time until a cure is found for even the worst of diseases. But when we as a nation undergo a period of crisis like that brought about by COVID-19, only then we can understand the great blessing that is contained in good health. Nursi quotes the proverb, "Light is indebted to darkness. Pleasure is indebted to pain. There is no health without illness." Nursi offers 3 reasons why those who have been struck with sickness should not complain. Firstly, sickness, like hunger, is necessary so that God can display God's goodness. God is the compassionate one who consoles the sick, the healer who takes away illness, the provider who gives food to the hungry. Secondly, illness is one of those events that show the value of life. Unbroken good health can become monotonous, flat, and empty. It resembles non-being more than the richness and fullness of life. Illness breaks the monotony, and in doing so, enriches, strengthens, and moves life forward. The third reason is that this world is a field of testing and service. Illness encourages the sick to become aware of the fragility of their lives and their need for God. Their helpless situation leads them to take refuge, to reflect, and pray to God for help. For the believer, states Nursi, sickness is like a veil that shields humans from the harsh reality of death. Were people to live constantly in good health, death would loom as an ever more terrible prospect, a horrifying reality that no one would be prepared to face. The fears and complaints about death would take over one's consciousness and destroy true enjoyment of life. Sickness serves to veil the horrors of death and serves to prepare people psychologically to accept reality. Should the sick pray to be healed? Nursi sees great value in this and takes the prophet Job as an example. Job asked to be healed of his illness, not for selfish reasons of comfort and release from pain, but so that he would be able to worship and serve God better. However, Nursi notes that the sick person should ask for healing with humility and trust instead of accusing God and complaining about the unfairness of his situation. Rather than complaining, which implies a criticism of God as sustainer of life, trust in God is a form of worship in which we place confidence in God's goodness and willingness to heal. Although Nursi speaks in many places about the role of sickness in the life of the believer, he also devoted a lengthy essay specifically aimed at offering guidance to those experiencing poor health and disease. This is his Message for the Sick, found in the 25th Flash of the Flashes collection. It is a collection of 26 remedies from which the sick person might draw profit. The reflections Nursi offers are not remedies in the sense of medicinal or physical cures meant to remove the illness, but are rather remedies for the types of despair and distress to which those in poor health are often inclined. In our world today, they are spiritual remedies for the sickness of the soul that has followed upon the physical, psychological, and social scourge of the pandemic. Nursi recognizes that the two central problems for all who suffer poor health, the two central problems are anxiety and impatience. Are these not the great preoccupations experienced today in a world faced with COVID-19? Anxiety arises from a sense of helplessness, the inability to do anything to change the situation, the nagging fear that illness will not be a transient state from which one will recover, but a permanent disability and ongoing affliction. Impatience comes from the sick person's feeling that time is passing too slowly and that he is wasting time that could be more profitably spent on other activities. Consequently, the sick person harbors a desire to change the situation precipitously. Just as today, many are tempted to ignore the medical experts and reopen society prematurely. Most of the remedies that Nursi offers are aimed at helping the sick person to overcome anxiety by accepting his afflicted state tranquilly and to find patience by placing his trust in God. In this way, the sick person can achieve peace of mind that, since it is conducive to physical well-being, can also help to bring about bodily recovery. I suggest that Nursi's remedies can help not only the individual who is laid low with illness, but can also help people around the world who are suffering from anxiety and impatience in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. Here are the points that Nursi asked people to remember. I hope that you will reflect on these points and find both consolation and hope in Nursi's insights. His first point is that illness actually lengthens one's life. A life passed without trial or hardship is fleeting and insubstantial. A sick person should realize that God has given this opportunity to come to a deeper and richer appreciation of life. Secondly, someone who does not complain but accepts illness patiently and takes refuge in God, that person is actually worshiping God. By submitting to God's will and trusting in God's power to heal, the invalid is performing very suitable and acceptable worship to God. His third point. Illness is an occasion for the believer to give witness that we are not on this earth simply to enjoy ourselves. We are here to work hard and prepare an everlasting life. Sickness is, as I said, a reminder of death, whereas heedless people whose attention is fixated on a trivial pursuit of pleasure and success, they don't want to think about death. Illness forces a believer to reflect on more serious questions of what life is all about. The fourth remedy is our bodies do not belong to us. They belong to God, who provides for us in God's own time and manner. Sickness is an occasion to learn that our bodies are not our private possession to dispose of as we wish, but are subject to the decrees of our true owner and provider. The fifth remedy. Sickness can make us more mindful of our dissolute habits and our duties to God. It is a time to wake up to what life is really about. For many sick people, Nursi states, the time of sickness is a privileged occasion of God's grace. For them, he said, illness is good health. But for some of their peers, good health is a sickness. He goes on, sickness should lead us to thank God for times of good health and peace. Rather than our giving in to bitterness and despair, we should reflect on the transient nature of illness and place our hopes in God, who can restore us to new times of good health and enjoyment. Sickness reminds us that our bodies are not indestructible. We have no claim to immortality. By shattering the myth of invincibility, illness is an antidote to human pride and an invitation to recognize humbly our powerlessness before God. His seventh point. Illness makes a person appreciate the great blessing involved in good health. Those who enjoy good health constantly are not able to value properly what they have. Good health is a wonderful blessing from God, but so that we appreciate it fully, God allows illness to afflict us from time to time. Sick people tend to bemoan their fate, but the really serious diseases are those of the soul, those that arise from unbelief and disobedience. By patiently accepting illness and placing our trust in God, we are distancing ourselves from more eternally threatening diseases. He goes on to his ninth remedy. Much of the anxiety felt by the sick is based on a fear of death. That's true. The believer, however, can overcome this fear by reflecting on the good things that await a person at death, rejoining one's friends, relations, returning to one's true homeland, and accepting the reward promised to those who remain faithful to God. By concentrating on what faith teaches about the reward awaiting believers, the invalid can come to accept death as something that need not be feared. Many sick people make their situation worse, he says, by worrying about it constantly. Anxiety is an accusation against God by implying that God is neither able nor willing to help. The only way to stop excessive worry is to hand over one's life and cares to God. There's no better solution to the self-defeating tendency to worry than that of placing one's trust in God. His 11th remedy. Norsi exhorts the sick person to remain patient and to focus on the present moment. When the sick person thinks of the past, he should be grateful to God because he has been able to endure illness up to this time. He should refrain from uselessly dwelling on future suffering, since that is something that does not exist and perhaps may never come to pass. Sickness, he says, brings us the benefit of knowing how much we are in need of God and how little we can count on our own strength. We discover our true value in relation to the Creator. By leading us to pray to God, sickness helps us to become aware that our true glory is to be found not in what we accomplish in life, but in our very nature as creature of God. His 13th remedy, he says, sickness can be beneficial in that it reminds a person to be heedful. No one knows their hour of death. Through their suffering in this life, sick people are led to reflect on the life to come. Sickness thus increases their fear of God and leads them to be faithful and obedient. It thus acts as a good preparation for eternity. And then he goes on. Just as the loss of physical sight enables one to see spiritual realities more clearly, so also whatever one lacks in this world can be used by God to teach and enlighten the sick person about deeper spiritual truths. If illness were not good, he said, God would not have allowed it to happen to God's servants. Like the prophet Job, holy people should suffer their illness as worship of God. And those who do this become, in a certain sense, martyrs. As Nursi said, they result in a degree of sainthood like martyrdom. In his 16th remedy, he says, illness can make one more compassionate. Constant good health can make one self-absorbed and self-sufficient. Sickness shows people their weakness and their need for others. They grow in respect and affection for those who help them and visit them. As a result of their misery, they can become more ready to be compassionate toward other victims of disease and disaster. Some people, he says, complain that their illness deprives them of the opportunity to perform good deeds. However, in reality, their illness provides an occasion for others to do good works by assisting and visiting them and by praying for them. Especially in the case of close relatives, caring for the sick is an important act of worship. When the sick person prays for healing, that person's prayer is always heard and answered, but not always in the way the person seeks. However, a sincere prayer is always acceptable to God. Too often, he says, the sick person compares himself to those who are in good health and feels that his rights are being violated. But no one has a right to good health, which is a free gift from God. A more positive attitude can lead us to compare ourselves with those who are worse off, so that we will be led to thank God that our health situation is not worse. In his 19th remedy, he says, life spent in permanent good health becomes monotonous and boring. It is through change and variety that we can realize life's value and come to appreciate its true pleasures. And then people make their health worse by confusing real and imaginary illnesses and treating them the same way. He says, in the case of real sickness, one must follow the advice of conscientious doctors. In the case of COVID-19, I would say this means following the advice and precautions of reliable medical experts in the field. He goes on, a sick person should try to identify and enjoy the pleasures that come with sickness, such as the signs of affection and human kindness from friends and relatives, and the opportunity to rest from strenuous duties. Illness reminds people of the fleeting nature of human life in this world. Through belief and submission to God, one can reap spiritual benefit from even the most serious illness. Then he goes on, one who feels lonely and abandoned in the time of sickness should contemplate the compassionate presence of God. The loneliness felt in the time of illness is not true loneliness, he says. True loneliness, which no human medicine can cure, is separation from God. But the believer who has faith in God and in God's healing presence is never really alone. His 24th remedy is directed towards caregivers. Those who care for the elderly will reap a special reward from God. And care for aged parents is a form of worship especially pleasing to God. So finally, believers should take advantage of their illness to deepen their faith in God. Illness should be an occasion to cut down one's appetites, to grow in seriousness and reflection, to deepen one's prayer life. Nursi concludes his treatise by praying for the sick with the words, "May God restore you to health and make your illnesses atonement for sins. Amen." Now, Nursi's attitude towards physical illness should be clear from this summary of the remedies that he proposes. From them, we glean insights into his spirituality. For Nursi, sickness is a human reality that, like all human realities, should lead one to God. The frailty of the body is a forceful argument against human tendencies toward self-sufficiency and complacent self-satisfaction. The sick person has to confront a harsh but ultimately liberating reality. That is, that one can do nothing to heal oneself, but must submit to what God ordains. Nursi's appeals to the sick person to accept their illness must not be construed as some kind of fatalism or defeatist passivity. He's very clear that when one is ill, that person must follow the prescriptions of a well-trained doctor, must take proper care of oneself, must pray for healing. However, medical science cannot guarantee immediate cures, and in many cases, cannot bring about any improvement in fighting the disease. We all pray for a vaccine to protect us from COVID-19. We pray for drugs to be developed that will effectively treat the disease. By working together with medical science, religious faith can produce results that are impossible for the unbeliever. By accepting the fact that one is in the hands of a loving and compassionate God, the believer can overcome natural anxieties and attain peace of mind, which physicians agree to be the emotional and psychological state most conducive to bodily healing. Moreover, Nursi is not guilty of romanticizing the sick person and saying sickness makes one more compassionate or the sick person comes to a richer understanding of life. He's not claiming that sickness gives people an inside track to virtue or that greater understanding and loving compassion are the automatic results of illness. What he is saying is that God can and does produce spiritual fruits like compassion and understanding in the sick person who cooperates with God's grace, who submits to God's decrees, and who patiently accepts his condition without complaining or accusing the Creator. For such a person, God is able to use the time of illness to make that person more compassionate and to understand better what is really important in life. Well, I'll conclude so we can have time for questions and answers. But by allowing the basic teachings of the Quran to shape one's attitudes and reactions to this most common of human hardships, Nursi offers a spirituality that is practical and suited to the needs of ordinary believers. With the advice he offers, he shows his followers how the unhappy condition of illness can be transformed by God's guidance into an opportunity and occasion for spiritual growth and a deeper submission to God's will. As a Christian, I find the wisdom that God has communicated to the world through Sayyid Nursi to be the product of God's own Spirit, who works wherever and whenever that Spirit wills. So, Michaela, I'll stop here, and maybe you'll have some questions or comments. It have to be questions, comments.
Thank you, Father Michel. That was very insightful. And I am personally humbled, I think, honestly, by some of the advice about how our spirituality can bring peace of mind in the midst of illness. We had one question put in the chat, and I'll expand upon it a little bit. I so appreciated your interpretation and Nursi's words on that illness can make us realize how dependent we are on others and how we're less likely to feel our own self-sufficiency. So in this time of COVID, where I think it seems like the gaps between communities are being exposed, how do you see, especially interfaith dialogue, building bridges, and as we are noticing that we're more dependent on each other?
Well, I think it can be a time for us to realize that people of other communities are not our enemies. They're not our competitors. And the way that we act shows that. I know that in St. Louis, and I believe in Chicago and elsewhere, Muslims have been very generous, actually beyond their percentage of the population, in terms of food banks and that kind of thing. Well, when people are generous to those who are in need, and we have so many in need now because of the unemployment, the widespread unemployment, people are worried about where they're going to live the next day. And when their Muslim neighbors give them some aid, help them in one way or another, help them with food, help them with in whatever it is, we're breaking down barriers. These barriers of prejudice, barriers of suspicion that people have with each other. I think that's a real opportunity for us. And I think this is what Nursi is talking about, is that sickness isn't just something that we complain and feel bad about, but it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity not only for worshiping God, but for serving each other.
Thank you. That makes great sense. I don't see that we have any other questions from our chat, but I guess one thing that I was also curious about is that thinking about the idea of cure or healing involves not just medical advice, but spiritual practices and the state of thinking that you're safe and loved by God. Do you think that in our medical field or in our fields of science and medicine that we should be considering more of a wholeness structure, that it's not just developed on science, but incorporates spirituality too? And how do you see that working today?
Well, of course, I know many doctors, nurses, other health care professionals who really do try to incorporate a true spirituality, whether they be Christians or Muslims or whatever, in their religious commitment into the work that they do. And from my point of view, this makes their contribution much richer and more widespread, so that the whole question of health and sickness and life and death is not just a purely scientific matter, not purely scientific, but a matter that also has a transcendent aspect to it, an aspect of God's reality, to take God out of the equation and just treat life as though everything is measurable. Well, that isn't the whole of life. There are things in the life that we can't measure in a laboratory. There's aspects of life that have to be lived, and I think that people of faith can bring these aspects into their scientific work. I don't think that faith is ever meant to replace science. Science has its own rules that it must follow, and you can't just say if you're sick or if you're in the middle of a pandemic, well, we're going to pray about it and it'll go away. That's not what God wants us to do. God wants us to act as though to use all the scientific resources and expertise and equipment that we can to try to combat this, and at the same time to find strength and guidance and hope in the spiritual resources that we have.
I think that is a perfect last word and answer to our conversation. Thank you again, Father Michel, for being here and your words, humbling words, inspiring words. I hope that we can follow Nursi's remedies in this time. I would like to also thank the Niagara Foundation and the Turkish American Society for putting this event on. It is a great pleasure and really uplifts spirits to gather in this way over the airways. So stay tuned for Niagara's coming events and lectures, and reach out if you have any questions or concerns for the Niagara group. Thank you everyone for this time together, and may you all be blessed and have a good Ramadan if you are observing that. May we all be together in this trying time as we remember our faith in God.
Thank you.